Joining us now is Faiz Shakir, Research Director and Editor of ThinkProgress.org at the Center for American Progress, and Jim Carafano, Deputy Director with the Heritage Foundation. Jim, let's start with you. A lot of the people who were pushing President Obama to add more troops, at least politically, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Joe Lieberman, they were also the same ones who were suggesting we focus on Iraq 6 years ago, which essentially had the effect of taking resources out of Afghanistan. That was a mistake, wasn't it?
Well, I don't think so. The truth is we didn't have enough army to fight both wars, and Iraq was in a much more critical situation back then. So this is a consequence of having an army that's too small that we can't fight on two fronts.
Faiz, so Afghanistan, therefore, is not as critical now as Iraq was then. Is that the argument?
Of course, Afghanistan is more critical than it's ever been, but Iraq was never critical, so you take that for what it's worth. I think the issue here, though, is that both sides of the debate have valid points. For the past 9 years, we've been engaged in Afghanistan, and there's been no evidence to suggest that American troops have helped that effort. On the other hand, when we've disengaged from Afghanistan, we've seen the problems that have resulted. 9/11, the emergence of al-Qaeda. When we moved troops from Afghanistan to Iraq, things got worse. So both sides have some validity. My own view is that you have to reduce the American face of this occupation in order to get any kind of stable, secure government in Afghanistan.
And Jim, it is true that the differences between Iraq and Afghanistan are stark. Simply, for example, in Iraq, we were able to get some help from the tribal leaders. No such help from the tribal leaders in Afghanistan. That's a big problem, isn't it?
Well, that's right. But the reason why the tribal leaders flipped in Iraq was because they saw that we were going to be there until the situation improved. And that's why you had them in the Sunni Triangle, the guys flop over. They hated al-Qaeda, but they wouldn't have turned to the U.S. unless they thought the U.S. was going to be there. We see the same thing, not just in Afghanistan. If we take the U.S. face off it, not only are the Afghan tribes not going to fight for us, but Pakistan is standing on the sidelines. And if they see there's no American commitment, they're not going to go after these guys either. So taking the U.S. troops away, it sounds nice, but I just don't think it's a rational and feasible course of action.
Right, but just to be rational about it, I mean, it's not like the Afghan troops are helping us right now. That's one of the big problems, is there are no Afghan police or security forces that are helping the United States.
And of course, and you need the U.S. forces to build up. Same thing we saw in Iraq. There were no Iraqi security forces. That's why we had to increase the U.S. troops presence there. Once we did that, once we build that force up, as you said, Iraq's not a land of milk and honey, but it's a lot better than it was in 2007. And that's because you had U.S. forces there that built up an Iraqi capacity to defend themselves.
David, can I make one point here? I think the single biggest failure so far of the Afghanistan effort has been the lack of our ability to convince our regional partners to get involved in this effort. We had the Bonn conference in December of 2001. Then we had an international aid conference in Japan in early 2002. Since that time, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, all of whom would be at threat if the Taliban were to emerge as the government in Afghanistan and for terrorism to rise in the region, they would all be a threat. And for some reason, we have not been able to convince those countries to pony up resources for this effort, and that's been, I think, the biggest failure.
One of the most influential columnists, of course, is the New York Times' Frank Ridge. Here's what he wrote in Sunday's New York Times. He compared Afghanistan to Vietnam and cited recent reports that most of al-Qaeda has left the country. Quote, some 535,000 American troops couldn't achieve a successful counterinsurgency in South Vietnam, which had half Afghanistan's population and just over a quarter of its land area. Nor can we score a victory against the world's dispersed stateless terrorists by getting bogged down in a hellish landscape that contains few of them. Jim, what's wrong with the argument?
Well, it's just bad history. The truth is we destroyed the insurgency in Vietnam. We destroyed it in 1968. It never recovered. What conquered South Vietnam was an invasion of a North Vietnamese army. So that's just really bad history.
Jim Carafano and Faiz Shakir, thank you both so much for coming on. We appreciate it. The debate, of course, will continue. Thank you.
Thank you.